Okay, thanks very much. Thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's my great pleasure to welcome you. I'm Joshua Tucker. I am the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia here at NYU. And thanks to everybody who's joining us online as well. It is an incredibly great pleasure today to welcome Oxana Shevel, who is an associate professor of comparative politics at the Department of Political Science at Tufts University, and now, I just learned, the director of the Tufts International Relations Program. Her research and teaching focuses on the post-Soviet region, especially Ukraine and Russia, and issues such as nation building and identity politics, citizen politics, memory politics, church-state relations, and the democratization process in the post-Soviet region. She is the co-author of the recent Russia and Ukraine Entangled Histories Diverging States, co-authored with Maria Popova, which was just published. You guys can purchase signed copies afterwards here. Those of you who are online, you can reach out and purchase them. And if you bring them to Boston, I'm sure Oksana will sign them, or you bring them to Montreal, Maria will sign it. Her earlier book, Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe, won the American Association of Ukrainian Studies Prize for Best Book in the fields of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. Her policy commentary has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Just Security, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and in other national and international media outlets, where she has been an especially important voice following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you have not been following Oksana online, I highly recommend that you do so. She also serves as the vice president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities and of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. Professor Shevel holds a PhD in government from Harvard University, where she was a member of the outstanding cohort of 1994 at Harvard then. So it is a huge, we've known each other now for 30 years. It is an incredible pleasure for me to welcome Oksana here today, and I'm super excited to hear about the book. So everybody, thanks for coming out today. And Oksana, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Jordan Center, and thank you all for coming and for all of you guys joining online. So I'm going to talk about this book that my friend and colleague Maria Popova and I have just published. The book is called Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories Diverging States, and it is essentially a book about the root causes of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So when we began to write this book, and we wrote it quite quickly following the start of the full-scale invasion in February, a lot of commentary in the media, in policy circles, emphasized the importance, or arguably the importance, of NATO expansion as something that provoked Russia, and sort of attributing invasion to Russia's security fears. We really, having studied Russia and Ukraine for a long time, did not feel that that was a compelling explanation. We wrote a few shorter pieces about it, and then eventually decided, with invitation from Polity Press, to write a book that unpacks the causes of the invasion, really shedding light on domestic politics in Russia and Ukraine. And the specific argument that we come up with, that we call escalatory cycle in this book, it's essentially an argument that over the course of 30 years, going back to the fall of the Soviet Union, in Russia and Ukraine has been this growing divergence domestically on these three issue areas: in identity politics, in regime types, and eventually in geopolitical orientation. And this tension between what we call Russia's commitment to re-imperialization, its commitment to bring Ukraine into the political fold one way or the other, and resistance in Ukraine to this process that proceeded in this sort of mutually reinforcing cycle over the course of 30 years, eventually, we argue in this book, is what produced the current war. So what I'm going to do today, I want to unpack this argument for you, what we mean by this escalatory cycle, what evidence we use, and how this cycle played out in these three issue areas. And then, depending on how much time left, we can talk about, current developments and the implication of our work, which is more about the causes of the war as opposed to the sort of the conduct or the outcome. But I think it does have implications also for potential likely and less likely ends of war. So, as I said, the story that we start with starts at the end of the Soviet period in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses. Here is the picture of presidents of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian republics at the time, who signed the Belozhesk agreement, essentially ending the Soviet Union. And that agreement followed independence referendum in Ukraine that was carried out early in December of 1991, where 92% of the population voted in favor of declaration of independence, essentially succeeding from the Soviet Union. So what we argue, and this is again, the evidence is there that historians have presented in their work, so we are kind of synthesizing, it's not something new finding in that sense, that from the very beginning, there was fundamental disagreement and misunderstanding about what the Soviet collapse was all about. As far as the Ukrainian leader was concerned, and President Kravchuk famously called it civilized divorce, that was the end of Russian-Ukrainian political union. So yes, there could be various forms of cooperation, economic, social, you name it, but Ukraine was basically striking on its own. It became an independent state. The independence received this endorsement across all regions of Ukraine. Kravchuk was the president of the new state, and he said that was a civilized divorce. That is not, however, how the end of the Soviet Union, collapse of the USSR, Belovezh Accords in particular, were perceived by Russia, including by the liberals in the Yeltsin camp. They, of course, had to acquiesce to the situation, and Yeltsin, for a while, in years before, when he was engaged in power struggle with Gorbachev, kind of leveraged the issue of Russian sovereignty in particular. But after Gorbachev, anti-Gorbachev coup collapses in August 1991, and then Yeltsin sort of emerges like the top dog in a way. And now there is a possibility of him becoming the leader of potentially a joint state. Again, as historians have documented, that there was much less interest in the collapse of the Soviet states. So yes, there is acquiescence that there isn't really much that could be done, having this result in Ukrainian referendum. But again, the perception is that this is sort of temporary misunderstanding, that one way or the other, Russia and Ukraine would eventually draw closer together. So again, it's not the argument that invasion was inevitable, but this expectation that the Soviet Union was really about the end of the Soviet Union was sort of a new beginning, right? There could be some other form of political union with Russia and Ukraine, and that sentiment was widely shared in Russia, but that was not the perception in Ukraine. So this is where sort of the cycle of divergence begins. The story in the Ukrainian side for the 1990s is really more sort of elite driving this divergence from Russia, more so than the public. The so-called grand bargain, which again is a term that Andrew Wilson, who is a scholar of Ukraine in the UK, have coined some years ago, so we use it. What it referred to is essentially referred to kind of informal agreements between Ukrainian right, which were nationalist national democrats who wanted Ukraine to become sort of like the Baltic countries, pro-Western, fully separated from Russia, looking towards the West. But then, like in the Baltic republics, they do not have majority in Ukraine. They receive about 25% of the vote in the last and only Soviet-free elections, legislative elections of 1990. And they basically cannot determine this agenda single-handedly. But this is where the bargain comes in, because Ukrainian political class, including substantial part of the former communist elite, the so-called center, President Kravchuk, first president of Ukraine, and President Kuchma, second president of Ukraine, were representatives of the center. So they were not particularly, we can say, ideologically committed to these national identity agendas, such as reviving Ukrainian language after decades of Russification or reinterpreting history of Ukrainian-Russian relations. So they were not particularly animated by it, but they were interested in ruling an independent state. So independent Ukraine was also in the interest of these former communist elites, this kind of newly found center. And then this bargain essentially results in the adoption of policies that serve to underscore Ukrainian distinctiveness from Russia. So things such as Ukrainian as the only state language, which was much less about sort of making people to speak Ukrainian, Russian remained widely spoken, that has begun to change, especially since the start of Russian war against Ukraine in 2014. But for many years, up until quite recently, Russian remained very widely spoken. And so this one state language policy was not so much about changing language practice, but it was more about a symbol of sovereign and separate statehood. The same goes for citizenship. Ukraine insisted on having single citizenship policy, meaning that dual citizenship was not allowed. And the main fear was that dual citizenship with Russia would dilute sovereignty, or could dilute sovereignty. In the hindsight, we could say the fears were realized. And also sort of Ukraine begins quite cautiously at first to reinterpret historical memory. So the narratives of this existential unity of Russia and Ukraine get reinterpreted in Ukraine with a more critical view. And sort of instead of emphasizing this continuity of fate, some past events get questioned, and sort of the narrative emerges that Ukraine, in fact, was struggling for sovereignty throughout its history, and it was Russian imperial power in the Tsarist period and ultimately the Soviet power that was opposed to these attempts. So there is sort of a different take on some of the key points in history and especially that affects the Soviet period. So again, in the 90s, these processes go quite cautiously, right? So now in Russia, on the other hand, there is quite a lot of resistance to this sort of identity changes in Ukraine. Russia continues to seek closer political union. It's been under various forms. There is Commonwealth of Independent States. There are various planned economic arrangements. Russia, for example, through the 90s, pushed quite hard for Ukraine to allow dual citizenship with Russia and potentially even common CIS citizenship, again, seeking various levers of political reintegration. But Ukrainian elite in the center-right bargain really holds the line, for lack of a better word, and refuses to engage, to change the policies in this direction that Russia wants. And here sort of helps us understand some puzzles with Ukrainian politics when, for example, presidents would come to power promising these policies, because in the 1990s, they were quite popular with the people, things such as dual citizenship or Russian as a second state language. And we have, for example, second President Kuchma, who campaigns on this agenda, who comes to power, who himself is Russian-speaking, representative of the sort of East Central, we can say, political class from East Central Ukraine, but then does not deliver on these promises. And that's exactly sort of this grand bargain logic helps to understand this, because ultimately they wanted to rule independent state, and these policies were seen as strengthening and underscoring distinction of Ukraine, right? So the political regimes in the 1990s were quite similar. Both Russia and Ukraine featured what has been called comparative authoritarianism, so there wasn't that much divergence yet on the political regime side, that although already in the 1990s, we can sort of begin to trace the beginning of divergence, because in Ukraine, for example, there has been peaceful transfer of power from the first to the second president. A compromise was struck between the presidency and the legislature, this crisis of the early 1990s that in Russia results in a violent confrontation, Yeltsin ordering troops to shoot at the parliament, where his opponents were holding fort the nationalists and sort of the so-called red-brown coalition, so big dilemma in Russian politics. And, many scholars have since argued that that was sort of the beginning of the end to Russian democracy. In Ukraine, this sort of similar conflict gets resolved differently, and political pluralism continues. So, and again, so there was this desire among a lot of the Russian elite to have some sort of closer political union with Ukraine. That political elite in Ukraine resisted. And in the 1990s, with all the transition, with all the state weakness, war in Chechnya, a lot of things were going on in Russia. So some sort of more aggressive measures to bring Ukraine to heel do not materialize. Now, on the popular attitude side, the story is also quite interesting. We go over it in the book, because originally, this divergence in Ukraine is really driven by the Ukrainian political elite more so than the public. So the public votes overwhelmingly for independence in 1991. But then if you sort of think about what did people associate independence with, and there were polls carried out at that time as well, not everybody associated independence with some sort of, say, national cultural or ethnocultural revival. Many people expected economic improvement. So there were campaigning done before referendum in Ukraine that if Ukraine becomes independent state, it would be as wealthy as France. I remember these flyers, like there was how much meat is produced, how many eggs, and we are going to live like France. Of course, that doesn't happen. 1990s is a period of severe economic crisis. And in the Ukrainian population, sort of this notion that some sort of closer integration with Russia, potentially even politically, certainly economically, may be a way to improve economic conditions, right? So again, as I was saying, kind of the popular attitudes are really quite a mixed bag, and probably more leaning, we can say, pro-Russian, but political class has a different agenda because they want to preserve independent state. But the public attitudes also did not stay still. Ukraine is often presented as a divided country. Some of you who follow Ukrainian politics, you may recognize this map, the orange and blue, sort of two halves of Ukraine. This is a map from the 2004 presidential elections when Yushchenko and Yanukovych were contenders for the highest office, and sort of this very stark divide. But if you look at it more closely, so we, for example, look at the regions where parties that declare the pro-Western orientation of candidates, how well do they do in different regions in Ukraine? And this map really shows, you can see, like the line changing and moving west. In other words, sort of the eastern half or pro-Russian half or Russia-oriented half of Ukraine over time begins to shrink. And kind of the more Western pro-sovereignty, pro-independence slowly begins to grow. So again, the story is much more complex. In the book, we get into all sorts of nuance about it, but sort of the broader trajectory is not in the direction that Russia would favor. So again, attitudes change very slowly. It's elites driving the process, but still the process is there. So the reality of independence sets in. People associate themselves with independent state. Young generation grows in independent Ukraine. So all of these things, kind of time, is really pushing in a certain direction of this greater separateness. Now, so in the book we talk about what we call critical junctions, when things really this divergence really accelerates. And the first critical juncture is the 2004 Orange Revolution. That was the time period when second President Kuchma, his 2 terms ran out, so he decides not to run for the 3rd term. And in Ukraine, the 2 contenders for the highest office is this very stark divide between Yushchenko and Yanukovych. So Yushchenko presents himself as sort of this Western-oriented, Ukrainian-speaking politician who wants to bring Ukraine closer to Europe, closer to the West, promote greater Ukrainian cultural agenda. And he's opposed by Yanukovych, who really advocates kind of closer ties with Russia, all of these things that Russia has long wanted: second state language, dual citizenship with Russia, stability, as in like, sort of Soviet-style stability and things like this. So eventually Yushchenko wins as a result of this Orange Revolution. And divergence further accelerates. In Ukraine in particular, under Yushchenko, we see this Ukrainization policies really accelerating, especially on historical memory. I'll show in a minute some statistics how, say, attitudes to the famine of 1932-33, which in the Soviet period we couldn't even talk about. It was, criminal, essentially, offense to even mention this. Then, of course, during perestroika period, discussion of the famine opens, but very different. So some 3.5 million Ukrainians die in this state-engineered famine. And the debate was it sort of just kind of the class saying that, Ukrainians had more agricultural land, they had more peasants, that was anti-peasant policy of Stalin regime, and that's why so many Ukrainians died? Or was it really also anti-Ukrainian policy? Was it essentially the sort of one version of this argument goes as far as saying that it was genocide of the Ukrainian people because Stalin feared Ukrainian nationalism. There is, evidence about that. Again, that was all debated in the media and by historians and public intellectuals. And essentially, Yushchenko legislates during his tenure, passes this law that Holodomor, as this famine is known in Ukraine, was essentially a genocide of the Ukrainian people. And that incredibly angers Russia, that wants to interpret it again as kind of common tragedy of the Soviet people, because if common state genocided Ukrainians, right, so the joint state becomes much less appealing. So again, it is sort of this broader concerns about what kind of political arrangement between Ukraine and Russia ought to exist. So Yushchenko also pushes for Euro-Atlantic integration. And we see also continued identity shift in the geographic center. I'll show in a minute an illustrative slide with these attitudes to the Holodomor interpretation. Now, so in Russia, this is important, in our argument. This is also the time period after 2004 when Russian relations with the West and the NATO would begin to sour. But what we argue that really it is the souring of Ukrainian-Russian relations domestically that precedes the souring of Russia-West relations over Ukraine's NATO aspirations. We have the whole chapter about it in the book, so I'm not going to go into greater detail, but essentially what we're saying, and we think the evidence is there to back it, that it is Yushchenko deciding to essentially pursue his own agenda without consulting with Russia on all sorts of areas, from domestic politics to foreign policy, but not on the foreign policy, that really angers Russia. Because at the same time in Russia, with Putin coming to power, this re-imperialization intensifies. So during Yeltsin, there were these debates, quite significant, sort of what kind of identity Russia is trying to construct. Soviet, Russian-speaking, ethnic Russian, some sort of combination of these things. Really, with Putin coming to power, this ideology of Ruski Mir, Russian world, becomes more prominent, and essentially kind of Russia laying claims to some not exactly specified territories outside its legal borders, but certainly territory including Ukraine. And then Putin also interprets 2004 events in Ukraine not as an outcome of domestic, very complicated, contested domestic political process that it was, but as some sort of Western ploy to weaken Russia. So this Orange Revolution, and this is the narrative that you would hear again, and more recently, you hear it now over the 2014 Euromaidan, that it was also a Western ploy, that it was Western orchestrated coup, CIA financed, all of this, that begins already in 2004. Now, we consider a few counterfactuals. So our story, even though Russian imperialization is important, this is not an argument about sort of Russia being somehow genetically an imperial power, and this is sort of being a predetermined outcome. There was a lot of contingency, there was a lot of competition. Things could have turned out differently. So in the book, we mentioned a few potential counterfactual developments. One of them, like what would have happened had political competition in Russia survived after Yeltsin. So after Putin comes to power, Russia becomes much more strongly authoritarian power. That process, unfolded over the years, but certainly in the 1990s was a more competitive period, and since then it became less and less competitive. So what would happen had political composition survived in Russia? What we suggest, of course, as social scientists, we know we cannot kind of rerun history and have exact prediction, but we do suggest that if there was more political competition in Russia, this invasion and war would have been less likely. Because even if this imperial identity remains strong, as it has been, at least there would have been disagreements about methods to achieve it. There would have been different political forces in Russia, and they did exist at the time, who advocated sort of bringing Ukraine back through economic means, for example. There was this notion of so-called liberal empire, that Russia would become an attractive, economically reformed country, which would then have all these former satellite states flock to it. Politicians such as Nemtsov, who eventually would get assassinated, right, could have a very anti-imperial voice, democratic voice, right, they would have had potentially more say. So in other words, identity divergence is important, but so is regime divergence, because had Russia remained politically competitive, that would have been potentially a different story, and we would say it would have made war less likely. Now, another counterfactual for that time period, what happened if the Orange Revolution ended with a different outcome? Some of you might remember that during the campaign, the Orange Revolution campaign, Yushchenko was poisoned with dioxin. He almost died. He, went to Germany for treatment, and then eventually was able to return to the campaign trail and, compete and win. But had he died, it is more likely than not that Yanukovych would have won. And then he would have had more time to both establish authoritarianism in Ukraine, sort of making it similar to Russia, and also to pursue identity politics that he would then try to pursue during his tenure as president after 2010, starting much sooner. So again, in this sense, sort of this escalatory cycle of divergence could have been reversed potentially. I don't think it would have been easy for him to do it, but again, this is one of these counterfactuals that I think interesting to consider. Essentially sort of delivering to Russia in a way that Putin wanted. More authoritarian, more pro-Russian, kind of reversing these divergences that began in the 1990s. So just again to show sort of this popular change in the popular attitudes, here is the poll on the asking Ukrainians if they agree that Holodomor, this famine, was genocide of the Ukrainian people, and already by the end of Yushchenko period, the majority agrees. So this process, which in the early 90s would have been before perestroika, would have been just something that so-called bourgeois nationalists would dare to speak about, and they would end up in the gulag for it. Then, sort of once it comes in the public discussion, it is really more maybe like West Ukrainian, we can say, set of beliefs. I'm sorry, why is this ringing? I don't know. And then, by the end of Yushchenko tenure, it's really changed in the geographic center. So that the center begins to look much more like the West, right? So that's just by way of illustration, and we have various other sort of similar data. Regime divergence is also evident from that period of time. These are various VDEM indices for electoral democracy, index for alternative sources of information for civil society, and we see this regime divergence really kicks in after 2004 in between Russia and Ukraine. So moving on, kind of how the story proceeds in our book, the period of time when potentially this divergence could have been reversed, and sort of by extension, invasion could have been avoided, was if Yanukovych managed to stay in power, if he wasn't ousted in the Euromaidan protests, because again, then chances are he could have at least tried to deliver Ukraine to Russia without the need for Russia to invade. Yanukovych, once he gets elected, narrowly but cleanly in 2010, pursues various identity politics, changes them in the direction Russia had long wanted. He, for example, abandons interpretation of the famine as the genocide of the Ukrainian people and embraces the sort of Russia-favored narrative of a common tragedy of Soviet people. He starts, apparently, the bureaucracy begins to work on the law on dual citizenship with Russia. Language law is also changed at the time, and the status of Russian language is elevated in Ukraine. He signs this infamous Kharkiv agreements that extend Russian Black Sea Fleet lease in Ukraine for 50 years. And so there are a variety of other maybe less prominent foreign and identity politics measures. At the same time, there is also growing autocratization under Yanukovych. His main rival in the 2010 elections, Yulia Tymoshenko, is arrested and jailed. The judiciary is subordinated. He cobbles through bribery and intimidation pro-presidential majority. He changes the constitution, increasing his power, so he's elected under the parliamentary system, but then reverts the constitution back to the presidential system. Right, so this sort of, and that parallels now becomes to parallel, as opposed to contrast with processes in Russia, where Putin, after he returns to presidency, launches autocratic consolidation as well. Putin wants to create, at that time, this Eurasian Economic Union. CIS of the 1990s did not quite achieve the goal of political integration, so now it's Eurasian Economic Union. He wants Ukraine to join in this union. Yanukovych sort of continues to fence it for a period of time. Even though he abandons NATO aspirations when he gets elected, he continues, his government continues to negotiate with the EU over this association and free trade agreement. And then at the 11th hour in November 2013, Yanukovych reneges on this association agreement. Later we learned that there was a bribe from Russia to the tune of, I now can't remember, we had the number in the book, was it $10 billion or something along those lines? So that story itself is quite interesting, but I'm not going to go over it. But this development then spurs Euromaidan protests, which would be the second critical junction in this growing tension between Russia and Ukraine. Now, so again, kind of the counterfactual potential is there to consider what would happen had Yanukovych succeeded in violently suppressing Euromaidan, which he tried to do but failed. Right? Could he then, having been really entrenched in a fully authoritarian regime that would have been reliant on Russia because he would have become essentially a pariah in the West, having shot all these protesters, in downtown capital city, could he have then delivered Ukraine to Russia had he stayed in office? We don't know for a fact. Domestic opposition would have still been there, but again, this is the kind of development that maybe could have again reversed that divergence, and Ukraine would have become sort of more like second Belarus, essentially vassalized by Russia, but without the need for military intervention. But that's not what happens. Yanukovych got ousted in the 2004 Euromaidan. And again, we see this sort of next round of this escalatory cycle playing out. In Ukraine, developments are really dramatic. This is when divergence really kicks in high gear. Pro-Russian electorate dwindles because Putin moves to annex Crimea, and then once he supports this separatist insurgency in eastern Donbass, about 12% of the Ukrainian electorate, which is the most Russia-friendly electorate, no longer gets to vote in Ukrainian elections. And then attitudes in the population also begin to shift. They're becoming more anti-Russian, more pro-Western, which in turn leads to the parties that before were on the political right and could not by themselves get majority, now get comfortable majority in the parliament and pass all sorts of legislation from decommunization. Here I see that you have a poster here of the Lenin Fall. That was the legislation that was passed in 2015. Ordering essentially removal of Soviet-era monuments, street names, and so forth. Again, kind of, diverging from very different from sacralization of World War II, Soviet victory in World War II in Russia. Language legislation makes sort of use of Ukrainian mandate is even stronger. There is also developments on the religious front. This Orthodox Church, independent from Moscow, is created in Ukraine. So all of these things are really taking Ukraine out of the Russian world. And additionally, there are also, anti-corruption reforms moved towards the EU and much, much greater support, first for European integration and eventually also for NATO increases in the Ukrainian population. Now, in Russia, again, sort of these developments is sort of the irony begins to kick in because annexation of Crimea and Russian support for the separatist insurgency in Donbass and kind of fostering it is what leads to these changes in Ukrainian society and Ukrainian politics. So in a way, Russian agenda backfires, but Putin remains blind to it. I'll come back to it in a minute. So this anti-Westernism, great power status, kind of high Putinism in Russia gets stronger, completely different sort of historical narrative, historical revisionism view of the Soviet period as really the golden age, and Ukraine increasingly is viewed as the period when Ukraine was oppressed in various ways by Moscow, right? And this growing commitment to re-imperialization, bolstered by success of the annexation of Crimea, which also bolsters Putin's popularity, leads to quite weak sanctions. So there is also interpretation on the part of the Russian elite that the West is essentially weak and wouldn't really stand in the way of Russian imperialization agenda in Ukraine in that time in particular. In the book, we also talk a little bit about Georgia, but sort of there was this pattern of Western response that arguably shows weakness of the West, and Putin is very attuned to that as well. So again, just to show some illustration of the changes that we're seeing in Ukrainian society, a much stronger sense of Ukrainian civic identity. This poll has been carried out in Ukraine since the beginning of independence. The pollsters, which is National Academy of Sciences, the Sociology Institute of Sociology, have been asking Ukrainians, how do you identify yourself? And there are various options chosen from various local identity. I'm resident of my town, or of my region. I am, have various sort of forms of subnational identity, global identity, and the option of citizen of Ukraine. And we see this, over time. And again, we see kind of jump after 2004, and then again jump after 2014, and again, of course, would be another jump, big jump after February 22 invasion. The use of Ukrainian language and support for Ukrainian as the only state language policy also grows. Again, it's in many parts a reaction to what Russia is perceived as doing in Ukraine, suppressing Ukrainian language in the territory that is occupied and so forth. So people now say that, not only they consider Ukrainian as their native language, even they may not necessarily speak it, so the actual shift takes longer. Again, in the book, we go into more detail, but, people also report speaking more Ukrainian at home. And then again, you see sort of that's a result of Russian aggression. So we have a jump in 2014 and much more substantial jump after 2022. Right. And also all of this is accompanied by much stronger support for democracy. So that's sort of another kind of confluence here of the stronger pro-Ukrainian identity, we can say civic identity with cultural elements being seen as important, and also this greater support for democracy. So 96% in the poll conducted in January 2023 say it's very important to them that Ukraine becomes fully functioning democracy. We see that it is essentially a consensus opinion across all regions, and every macro region it's over 90%. And yeah, again, this change in political power, I mean, this is sort of humorous mixture here, but it does capture the reality that in Ukraine, there have been many changes at the highest office, right? Presidents gave power, or in case of Yanukovych, were forced to give power. And then in Russia and Belarus, similar cultural, Slavic, shared history, you name it, a quite different divergence there, right? And of course, foreign policy orientation is very important, and that's why the divergence is really evident, especially with regard to NATO membership. So again, this sort of idea that Ukraine, even though NATO membership was imminent, of course, anybody who studies the situation with Ukraine and attitudes towards Ukraine membership in NATO among NATO members themselves, Ukraine had exactly zero chance of entering the alliance, not least because there was no majority support for that in Ukraine. There was no domestic consensus. So it's in the book, we go over some counterfactuals, like could have the West reacted differently. And one possibility is what if Ukraine could have been admitted sooner? It could have perhaps deterred Russia from invading, but of course the problem, and in some sense, the tragedy was that, at the time when it may have been possible, there was no domestic consensus for it in Ukraine. And by the time domestic consensus emerges, that was already after Russia invaded. So we see that, right, support growing for EU membership, and support for NATO membership in particular, that really increases, and in particular following the invasion of 2022, but begins to increase starting after 2014. Right, so we essentially have this sort of full rupture. Again, the irony with, is not lost, I hope it's not lost on you, it's certainly not lost on me, that it is this Russian pressure, Russian desire to keep Ukraine into the fold, to kind of re-vassalize it, that really backfires in Ukraine. And produces this much stronger anti-Russian attitudes that really no Ukrainian nationalist could have hoped to foster without Putin's aid. So that's really quite ironic. And it's interesting because Putin, it seems like to this day, remains completely in denial that there is this really genuine domestic political process that has gone on in Ukraine, producing these attitudinal changes. I remember reading his interview at one of the Valdais before the full-scale invasion, but after 2014, when these patterns were already becoming apparent, and one of the journalists asked him, so what do you make of these opinion polls from Ukraine that show these kinds of changes? And he was completely dismissive of it. So the answer he gave was either that you cannot trust these polls because it's all fake news, or that people are really hiding their true pro-Russian preferences because they're ruled by Nazi junta. So again, if that's the thinking, you can sort of then begin to see that when the invasion, full-scale invasion starts in February, Russian troops travel with parade uniforms. They really expected, at least some of the leadership expected to be greeted like liberators. None of this happens because again, through this imperial lens, Putin seems to be unable to really take Ukrainian agency seriously. That there was independent from the West, things were happening domestically in Ukraine, and that was some of the outcomes. If you see it as meddling of the West or as some sort of Nazi junta suppressing people who really want to be with Russia, then you draw certain conclusions. So unfortunately, it seems like that's the mindset he remains in, and that certainly has been the mindset before the invasion. So the invasion essentially takes place because other methods of pressuring Ukraine fail. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it now, although I'm happy to answer questions. We'll go quite a bit in half of the chapter of the book about the failure of the Minsk peace process. And the Minsk peace process, we argue, was not really about Donbass. What really Minsk agreements were tried to achieve, as far as Russia was concerned, is a way to use these Donbass proxies to control central Ukrainian government. So it was not really about controlling any bit of Ukraine. It was not about protecting Russian-speaking population, none of that stuff. It was really the so-called special status that was quite vague, but in Ukraine and Russia had very different notion of what it would be, and what Russia wanted it to be worded in such a way, and in a way they had leverage, because the agreement said that special status had to be agreed with the representatives of these proxy republics, that essentially any kind of foreign policy decision or domestic policy decision that Russia didn't like could be vetoed by this proxy. So in a way, it was a way to control the entirety of Ukraine. And Ukrainian political elite, including Zelensky, who comes to office with a promise to sort of try to find solution to the Donbass conflict, very quickly realizes that that's what Russia really wants. So it was not about any sort of specific language rights or the way police is going to be organized there or elections or none of these things. It was really this sort of special status. So we call in the book this Minsk agreements a Trojan horse, as they were. And once they failed to enter the gates of Kyiv, so essentially, it becomes clear that Ukrainian government would not agree to this de facto vassalization by way of Minsk. That's when sort of Putin throws in the towel and escalates the methods yet further for the full scale invasion. So this is like I'm ending here. I just wanted sort of this a few things on the slide. I already mentioned that this Ukraine becoming kind of what Putin calls anti-Russia. It is true. By now, there has been complete rupture. But importantly, that this rupture was in no small part due to Russia's and Putin's own actions. So in a way, he would have accomplished exactly the outcome he tried to avoid in that sense. Now, if we think about sort of what role does the West play, we argue in the book, and I'm sure not everybody would agree with this, but we say that the main mistake was not the West provoking Russia, but the main mistake was not containing it sooner and stronger. So again, it sort of goes to Russian invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, the things that were happening all through this time. We have the whole chapter about it. Again, I'm not going to go into every detail, but there is a lot of evidence how the West was differential to Russia, engaging with Russia, buying Russian gas, doing all sorts of various forms of cooperation. And one could say that that didn't work, right? We know that didn't work. So potentially, if containment happens sooner and containment has been stronger, maybe that would have been a better strategy. So that's certainly, something we can't know for a fact, but we do believe that that's a reasonable argument, right? Now, this notion that Putin really wants all of Ukraine, I think it's very important for any kind of potential land for peace hope that we hear, from, there's a Russian expression, which means from every iron, right? Like you pick up an iron and there is a talk about land for peace settlement. So, so that's essentially, we don't think that's likely or a good idea or possible, because it is not about, for Russia, it's not about controlling some kind of sliver of Ukraine. It's not about Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics. It's not about the so-called new territories. It is really about controlling entire of Ukraine. This is why the Minsk agreement was all about. This is why there was a push for Kyiv at the beginning of the war. And unless all Ukraine is subjugated, and now the Russian elite doesn't even hide it. I mean, Medvedev, former president of Russia, is the most vocal of them all. But Putin talks about it, as a senior Patrushev, all of them talk about it. So in Ukraine, there is a realization that this is what it is about. It is an existential war. So even though counteroffensive did not produce the results, there are various challenges domestically, with the Western aid, U.S. military aid being stuck here with all this thing going on in the US Congress, but still majority of Ukrainians remain of the opinion that any kind of territorial compromise is just not something that would bring us in peace, and I think that's important to keep in mind, right? Other sort of just a few things that I've mentioned towards the end. One of the things, and this is something Maria would be much more qualified to talk about it because her expertise is on the anti-corruption and judicial reforms and rule of law. She has argued and written elsewhere, and we briefly talk about it in the book, that the extent of reforms in Ukraine has been actually much more extensive than Ukraine is given credit for. So anti-corruption reforms, judicial independence reform, all of this makes Ukraine actually more prepared for EU membership than many candidate states that are now in the EU when they were candidate states in the 1990s. So Ukraine is sort of at a better starting point. So that's also something, the story we don't hear very often in the Western media, because the predominant narrative is how Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt, but that's actually not the case. Not to say that corruption is not a problem, but it's really, a lot has been done and so forth. And now, the last point is pretty obvious. I think these sorts of things are, if we're thinking about what's more likely and less likely ways looking forward, these variables are at play. Western aid, right? Ukraine relies on Western military support. It is absolutely critical, even though there is various domestic production. Europe is stepping in. Still, US military aid has been very important. So what sort of happens with it would clearly have an impact on conflict, its both the war conduct and possible outcomes. Domestic unity or disunity in Ukraine is also an important factor because obviously the longer the war drags on, sort of the more society is tired, the more divisions emerge. This is not, this is typical. This is what happens when countries at war. We, now here there's been in the last just few days discussions disagreements between Ukrainian political and military leadership. So again, there's sort of, a piece of variables to consider. And of course, developments within Russia itself. So again, they, not something we go about in the book, but I mean, now I think we have to look very carefully about what is it that's actually happening in Russia domestically. I remember the collapse of the Soviet Union when, it collapsed, there was no shortage of theories, but nobody really predicted it. So with this close authoritarian regime that Russia has become, that there is really, we don't even know all that much what's happening there. So I think, the more we can understand political and economic developments within Russia, which are now admittedly very hard to study, I think the better predictions we could make as to where all of this is going. So I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, Dima, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks. So, Oksana, I wanted to thanks. This, by the way, great presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And what I was at the very beginning, you said this is about the imperial. The cause of the war was the imperial desires of Russia, which makes sense to me. But the other cause that's often mentioned is kind of Russia's war against the West, or perception of it, that it's at war against the West, and sort of the NATO enlargement component and all of that. And I was just wondering where you see that coming in. And, a lot of times these are presented as either or. I've always seen them as both, but I just wanted to see, to know what you thought about it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Dima, for the question. It is both. I mean, we wouldn't say that, that Russia liked NATO expansion or anything like that, right? But then again, this perception that, first of all, the imperialization itself, as I was saying, we are not trying to make this like essentialist argument and then like Russia is biologically imperialist and all the Russians are imperialists, and that sort of, that seems analytically not very satisfying. So first of all, we unpack kind of the process of re-imperialization. It wasn't overly determined. Things could have worked out differently. They didn't, but they could have hypothetically, right? So that's sort of for the imperialization part. And then, with the NATO, I think the story we try to say is that this disagreement and divergence between Russia and Ukraine, and especially Russia resenting Ukraine sort of not behaving as intended vassal, really sours Russia-West relations. So in the 1990s and 2000s, there was quite, even cooperation, certainly not sort of very hostile antagonistic relations between Russia and the West. And when Kuchma starts rapprochement with NATO, there is really no objection from Russia, because at that point it is seen that sort of vassal is moving in lockstep with its intended kind of leader, right? So Ukraine is doing something that Russia itself is doing. And it really begins to sour when Yushchenko strikes on his own, right? And he begins to, and not just on NATO, I mean, NATO was one of it, but he also does all of these things domestically that Russia really, really hates. And then the interpretation, and this is, I think, where the imperialism helps to understand that, because this imperialist lens denies agency to Ukraine in a way that Yushchenko came to power because the way the Orange Revolution played out for a host of domestic reasons, right? The interpretation becomes that this is the Western ploy, right? And of course, Orange Revolution comes after Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then they overthrow Milosevic in former Yugoslavia. And this narrative develops, right, in Russia, that it is the West sort of like playing all of these insignificant states to try to get at Russia, right? And of course, we can also think about that in some sense, democratic Ukraine presented the challenge to Putin's authoritarian model, because if Ukraine becomes a democracy, why can't Russia, right? If civil society can mobilize and overthrow, president in Ukraine, like why can't they do it in Russia? And they really see, Putin kind of proofing Russia against all of this social mobilization that, we're not going to go. So I don't know if it's a very satisfactory answer to your question, but I'm trying to say that, yes, it is both, like it's not sort of either or. But if we want to say, like, in which ways sort of the order of things goes, or which was relatively more important, in the book, we argued this divergence domestically was more important, and in a way then conditions the souring of Russia-West relations, right? And that's a different story to say that whatever was happening in Ukraine sort of like has its own thing, but it's really, NATO encroaching on this Russian rightful sphere of influence and so forth that leads to war. So that's the narrative that we are arguing against.
Hi, this is fascinating, and I especially like the treatment of counterfactual. I wanted to ask about one of them. So in the early 2010s, when Yanukovych, so you talked a little bit about Yanukovych's potential sort of trajectory, becoming this more authoritarian leader. But I'm wondering, do you think this was really sort of the plan, the calculus on Yanukovych's side, on the sort of pro-Yanukovych, pro-Russian elite side? Did they really expect to do the same as Putin did in Russia, given that they knew that there was a large pro-Western constituency? So I'm wondering, and of course there's that counterfactual, but I'm just interested in what you think about this. And I guess a related question is, why couldn't Yanukovych sort of shift in a more pro-Western direction? Because he wasn't ideologically or in terms of identity probably tied to Russia. What was preventing him from doing that?
Right. No, this is an excellent question. Of course, here we're going to be sort of, doing educated speculation because, right, who knows for a fact. But I would say this. So first of all, Yanukovych, I think we say, genuinely wanted to be kind of unchallenged ruler. So he did want to establish authoritarian form of government because it benefited him, right? He wasn't into this sort of let's compete, uncertainty. The incumbent has to sweat on election night. He moves in very forcefully, and we don't really go into it in the book that much, but there are kind of more like sociological, even almost anthropological studies of specifics of Donetsk clan, Donetsk politics in the 90s, the region where he came from, kind of the skill of the killed mentality, his own personal past. He was, Assad was in jail, like he was, the guy who would beat you on the street, that kind of stuff. But we don't go into that. So I think the authoritarianism on his part was genuine. But you're right that Ukraine was not Russia in a way that this sort of pro-Western, kind of democracy, nationalist constituency, whatever you want to call it, was there and it didn't disappear, right? And I think this is why he continued with the EU. Because that would have been very smart strategy. Because if he, in fact, delivered this trade agreement with the EU, that would have gotten him votes from the West as well, without losing votes to the East. Because EU was not really that controversial in Ukraine. NATO was much more controversial. But say his voting base in the East and South of the country would not have turned away from him had Ukraine joined with this free trade agreement with the EU. But the West Ukrainians who voted against him then could have voted for him, right? Because he delivered kind of the cultural geopolitical agenda that they wanted. And he really, I don't want to feel bad for Yanukovych because he was not a nice guy to feel bad for. But if you read this kind of developments on the last sort of this, especially months before eventually he caves into Russian pressure, he's really torn. He complains about that, Russia is strong arming him, that they started the trade war. That's important also kind of for the whole story. Because it was not, even before Yanukovych was on the throne, when he signals that he wants to go with the EU, Russia starts trade war with Ukraine. So but they were not just objecting to NATO, they were objecting to this kind of geopolitical turn to the West, right? But then he also had a dilemma because the EU also wanted him to release Tymoshenko, the main opposition leader, right? Like that would have potentially increased political competition. So he, like, could he have, so your question was, could he have pursued kind of more pro-Western policy, right? Because he was not ideologically, particularly anything. He was like, very pragmatic, as they so крепкий хозяйственник, right? I think he could have, but then again, it sort of becomes a dilemma because if you pursue sort of more, we can say, pro-Western, pro-democratic politics, you increase political competition to yourself. So that's also not in your interest, right? So I think this sort of, the authoritarian consolidation was more likely. So hypothetically, these other things could have happened, but given the overall sort of cost and benefit analysis that I think he had to deal with, authoritarian competition, and then support from Russia, because, for example, the incredible corruption of his regime meant that they were like, the treasury was empty, they needed money. IMF is offering a loan, but it's conditional on all sorts of reforms he does not want to pursue, because he essentially installed his so-called family, which was his, I can't remember, older younger son, and all of the buddies of his son, who were like stealing, from the country. And IMF says do reforms, but this sort of theft of state resources would be not possible. But Russia doesn't care. They are giving him loan not to join with the EU trade agreement, right? So I think the broader calculus, that's why we think that the more likely counterfactual would be that he would have tried to consolidate authoritarianism and then deliver these identity issues, which were close to him. He was not particularly animated by it, but certainly some people in his party were. And, and that's what Russia would have wanted, and he would have gotten, right, the money. And yes, of course, there would have still been the problem of this pro-Western electorate. And that's why I personally don't think, like, if somebody told me, like, make a prediction, I'm not sure he could have actually strong-armed that much of Ukrainian population into submission. I'm not sure he could have. But at least it was not completely out of the question. So.
Do you have a question?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, one point I would make is, I've read that, the US, I think we did spend something close to $65 million in 2004 and 2003, 2004 in the run-up to the Yushchenko revolution, the Orange Revolution. I think it was Ron Paul who was complaining about that from a budget standpoint, and that the US was, in a way, trying to work with Putin in that period, because after 9/11, there was particularly after the Iraqi war, to sort of build a little bit more military intelligence cooperation with the Russians on these issues. And so I do think the Americans were, putting money in to make efforts at Ukraine, but simultaneously probably trying to keep working with the Russians on this Middle Eastern issue. The question I have actually has to do with what, we have people at, elite policy here in the US that kind of assume that if Russia fails, if it collapses, it kind of shatters like glass, that we'll be there to just pick up the pieces. But part of me thinks it'll be China that picks up all the pieces. This last year, they were given carte blanche to travel, a lot of trade through Vladivostok. The Amur annexation of 1858 was more or less this vast amount of Chinese territory that went to Russia about 150 years ago. And I almost kind of had this image of all that kind of going back to China when, Russia actually failed in this effort, finds itself utterly depleted, very dependent on, North Korean armaments, the Iranian drones, and maybe even Chinese money. What happens if the Russians fail? And fail badly, I guess.
Thank you. It's sort of like two questions there. Let me briefly say about the 2004. It is true that US was putting money, but the critical difference is that Russia was putting money directly into Yanukovych's campaign. They literally were giving money to his campaign. There were big billboards with Yanukovych in Moscow. Putin came to Kyiv to campaign for him before the election. And US was putting money into these democracy promotion organizations, right? It is like the clean vote, get out the vote, how to do it, parallel vote count, all of these things. Now, of course, sort of cynically, we can say that given that in the polls, Yushchenko was more popular, these democracy promotion measures were also favoring kind of more pro-Western candidate that US probably liked better than Yanukovych, right? So sort of the question to US I don't know whether like policymakers would be, had they been doing the same, if meaning promoting the democracy measures, clean elections, vote counts, large number of people voting, if the candidate who stood to benefit was not pro-Western, right? Like that would have been sort of a dilemma for US policymakers, but that's not what happens in Ukraine. And I think that's important in 2004, because I mean, at least I think it's a big difference between giving money to a campaign and giving money to the electoral process, right? So they funded NGOs who then went out got the vote and all of this kind of stuff. But you're right, it was happening at the same time, this cooperation after 9/11. But then again, Putin sort of comes to interpret this, that it was somehow like Western orchestrated, outcome. And in reality, it was free electoral process, which was aided by these measures because these agencies, I mean, people were, I remember I was actually an observer in one of the districts in Ukraine in the rerun of this 2004. And like, it was, everybody knew what they were doing, right? Like what part of the electoral law, people went to trainings, they did how to do parallel vote count, like all of that kind of stuff, right? So the result was a clean election, but it benefited the candidates also in the Westlight, right? So here is a bit of a dilemma. Now, on this sort of, if what happens if Russia collapses, first of all, I would say, and we talk a little bit about it in the conclusion of this, of the book, we don't think it's very likely, right? This sort of like easy parallels, well, Soviet Union collapsed, like, was multi-ethnic country, like, wouldn't Russia the same when it would collapse and how many republics, are there? Like, we just don't think, like, why that's an appropriate parallel. Because in a way, if we look at the evidence since the beginning of the invasion, there were so many setbacks, so many so-called red lines were crossed, as far as Russia. From the sinking of Moscow to, Ukraine liberating over half of the territory Russia captured, including part of Kherson that they put in their constitution that should have theoretically triggered nuclear response because it was now Russian territory. None of this has happened, right? And I think Putin, given the extent of domestic political control, didn't have by the end of the Soviet period, not at all. The party was essentially disintegrating. There was a sort of opposing centers of power in the republics created by the elections that he himself authorized. Like none of this exists in Russia. So I think if Russia is kicked out of Ukraine, at least we don't think that that would trigger some sort of collapse within Russia, right? So that's in a way like you asking me a question about the possibility that I don't think is very likely at all, right? But then I don't know. I'm just sort of trying to think like. It's even hard for me. I don't want to just like pull something out of my ear. I mean, in the way which you're saying that China might benefit seems reasonable to me, but I think this very outcome.
I read somewhere that they're spending like 3.3% of their GDP now on armaments.
And they increased it by like 40%, right?
Yeah. And that kind of would exhaust an economy. So it's if they do fail, then usually there's sort of a period of
but again, like what's failure, right? Like. I mean, they've done many strategic retreats, right? Like you can, given the control of the media space, of the propaganda, I think a lot of things could be spun as a victory, right? We demilitarized Ukraine, right? Like, look, we decimated the army, right? Like, I mean, so I think it's not, clearly it wouldn't be that potentially easy for them just to march, to pack up and go home, but I think they could without Russia disintegrating. With the level of control that they have, with lack of opposition that they have, with all of these regional governments that used to be very powerful during late Gorbachev period, which are completely powerless now. So this idea that there would be some sort of like centrifugal movement, it doesn't seem very likely to me.
But
we can all be surprised.
If he loses Crimea, though, I've heard that they can't even defend Crimea anymore.
Well, that's the thing. They lost 20% of their navy, right? Like, why is that not a big story in the West? Ukraine just sunk another ship yesterday, like the country without the navy. And they haven't disintegrated, and Putin still seems to be, whichever one of many Putins supposedly is there, right? So again, like that's kind of, we are speculating here, but we do talk, we devoted a few pages sort of doing this comparison with the late Soviet period and Russia now, and basically saying that the parallel is not exactly identical.
We've got a bunch more questions, so let's move on. So Natanya Parat, who's online, says she's got her entire class of students watching the talk with her. So we have a much bigger audience than we even thought. Here's one question that a student submitted for the class. Would be curious to hear what you would say. Michael Kaufman argues in a 2017 RAND report that Kiev could hardly have done a better job at helping the Russian causes in weeks and months following Maidan. by removing legal protections of the Russian language, turning a blind eye to far-right volunteer battalions like Pravdivny Sektor, cutting loose the Berkut riot police after they had returned to Crimea. Kiev played into the Russian propaganda narrative while simultaneously providing a large supply of well-trained and disgruntled fine fighters. So going back to counterfactuals, were there other courses of action that Kiev could have pursued, and would they have made a difference?
Yeah, good question. A couple of things I would say to this. So first of all, it is largely forgotten by now, but the comparison of post-2004 and post-2014 immediate aftermath of these, critical junctions is worth recalling, because after Yushchenko wins in 2004, there is very short-lived, and probably nobody remembers it anymore. South Ukrainian People's Republic was declared in Ukraine. Anybody remembers that? South Ukrainian People's Republic. Unfortunately, abbreviated as PSUR, which literally means UN. So that was not very lucky abbreviation. But so it was essentially the same thing. There were disgruntled elites and a lot of the public in the southeast of the country that did not support order revolution, just like Euromaidan had regional basic support. And then when new government comes to power, there is a fear on the part of these elites that they would be sort of out of potentially economic pie and political pie, and they formed these, declare the South Ukrainian People's Republic, kind of autonomous, very similar to what we saw in the. Now, the key difference is that at that point, Russia is not interfering, for reasons that, we can discuss, is not interfering in a way, there is no Crimea precedent that they annexed it, right? There is no sort of Russian operatives going to these territories, taking over buildings. And Ukrainian political elites reached a compromise, right? I don't remember honestly what the compromise was. It was messy. It was something sort of like, difficult to untangle, but they did it. And there was a history of this Ukrainian political class. And, by extension, also the society coming sort of finding a way to live together. Now, the big difference in 2014 was that there was Crimean precedent, which happens right away, right? And then there were all these Russian operatives and Russian tourists and tourists, quote unquote, who are coming to Eastern Ukraine in this protest. So there was also domestic protest. I wouldn't say that the whole protest was completely engineered by Russia. There was a lot of disagreement, dissatisfaction. And this language situation that the student is asking about, the story is actually a little bit different because the language law, the Turchina vetoes, right? So that was really dumb move. So if that's I would agree with this, that there was a vote in the parliament to annul this 2012 language law, which elevated the status of Russian. And then the acting president vetoes the law, so it doesn't become law. I don't think that was detrimental for two reasons. So first of all, the law in fact never came into force. And second of all, even if it did come into force, it was basically reversing the situation to year before 2012. What was happening before 2012? There was no genocide of Russians. There was Russian still was widely spoken, all of these things, right? And then these volunteer battalions, they really don't come in until quite a bit later, because it would be after the buildings would be taken over, after Crimea essentially would be annexed, and then this, building takeover starts in the Donbass. Ukrainian army at that point has like 5,000 battle-ready troops, if I remember the correct statistics. And this is when these volunteers, come in, and certainly, yes, some of them have far-right ideologies. But given, so I think, the sort of long, short answer to this question is that given critical difference was 2004, Russia annexing Crimea, creating this precedent, and then, also sending its operatives up to Eastern Ukraine. And there have been since then this released tapes, the so-called Glaziev tapes. We also go over them in the book a little bit. They had a plan. The plan was that these protesters would force, and the Russian operatives would force local legislators from the regional parliaments in the southeast of Ukraine to vote no confidence in the Kyiv government and create these people's republics. That was Moscow plan that it was trying to carry through. It was not a response, some sort of spontaneous popular reaction to language law and so forth. So in a way, that language move was a dumb move. I would agree with this. But I don't think it was something that caused this sorts of course of developments, again, given what Russia was doing in 2004, which it was not doing in 2014, which it was not doing in 2004.
Okay. Bruce Rawson, I think, online.
I recently read, this was in the past week, that the Russians have begun to move their ships out of the Crimea to territory they had earlier seized in Abkhazia, in Georgia. And I'm wondering in the I mean, this is historically how Russia got put together as an empire. And then the post-Soviet so-called CIS. To what extent, if this can be substantiated, is there some sort of relationship, say, between what Ukraine does vis-a-vis defending its sovereignty and Georgia, a substantial part of its territory, occupied with two microstates that nobody other than Russia recognizes. I mean, is there any conversation here, and how does this fit into the mix? And what does it mean if, in fact, since a major point of what Putin's there is this historic naval base in the Crimea, that they would actually begin to move to shift out of that naval base? What is then going on that's not being covered?
So I think the fact that Russia is moving its naval assets from Crimea goes back to the point that the question that was raised earlier, that Ukraine, a country without a navy, is basically able to really negatively affect to the point of in almost non-sustainable Russian presence in the Black Sea. And yet, so this is like potential red line and all of this, and it doesn't lead to either disintegration in Russia or some sort of implosion and so forth. So I think that's kind of related, maybe separate point, that I think when we talk about red lines, I don't think Putin knows himself what his red lines are, because so many of these red lines have been declared and the ultimate crossed. If you remember his speech at the beginning of the invasion, when he says, whoever stands in our way would face the consequences you've never faced in your history, right? That was clearly a veiled nuclear threat, and look at that, right? Finland joins NATO, right? Sweden joins NATO, Moscow is saying, I mean, we can continue the list, and the consequences, like, we're still here talking about it, right? He hasn't nuked us all. So I think that's sort of something to be kind of this, what's the English expression for it? Bluff maybe, obviously nobody wants nuclear war, but I think the evidence is there that when Putin is pushed, as many rulers do, he retreats, right? So that's one of it. Now, the parallel with Georgia and Ukraine, I mean, it is really interesting because I'm no expert in Georgia, so here I'm just kind of, maybe experts will give a different answer. But it seems to me what happened in Georgia, potentially something that Russia would have liked to see in Ukraine, meaning that in Georgia, after they annexed these territories, then, various domestic instability was created, there was also Georgia did not integrate into NATO or the EU. And then, so eventually this kind of more Russia-friendly political actor in case of Georgia, was his name, Zinda Ivanishvili, right, comes to power, who is, maybe not doing everything that Russia wants, but is certainly, palatable. So I think in a way, Russia maybe would have liked to see something like this in Ukraine, right? That at least as an interim step, that they hold on to the territory that they now occupy, and then it creates some sort of domestic, and again, if some sort of peace deal was forced on Ukraine, because Ukrainian political elite is saying very clearly they will not sign it, and the society is behind them, so it's not that like society wants to sign and Zelensky doesn't, or the other way around. But if say somehow maybe that, I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of kind of Russian preferred plan, that if something like this were to happen, right, and then domestic instability results in Ukraine, and then somehow, some way or another, somebody comes to power in Ukraine who is basically sort of nominally independent, but in reality is doing what Russia wants, not unlike this president in Georgia. So I think Ukrainians are aware of this. Again, I can't speak with authority about Georgia, but the parallel there is interesting. And with the naval base, I think, yeah, they're moving. I mean, I heard that I think Novorossiysk, where they already have a base, some assets are moved there, and then they're planning to build something in Abkhazia. So again, it sort of goes to show that the Black Sea is not safe, given what Ukraine is doing, despite not having a navy. And yet, the so-called red line did not produce some sort of implosion within Russia or these dire consequences that some fear that might happen.
Yes.
Thanks so much for the great talk. You briefly mentioned Ruski Mir, and I was curious whether you think that whole ideological platform is still playing a large role at this point, and if so, kind of at whom is that rhetoric directed? Is it directed at Russians in Russia? Is it directed at Russians elsewhere, at Ukrainians, and sort of, is that message still live? And
Well, as they put on billboards in Russia, borders of Russia don't end anywhere. So I think that's kind of this narrative of the Ruski Mir. I mean, I always think, I find it useful to think about it as sort of like a Matryoshka thing, right? Because there are certain things that definitely belong, like Ukraine is clearly in the Ruski Mir as far as Russia is concerned, so that's not a question. Maybe with the possible exception of the so-called Catholic westernmost Ukraine that used to be part of Poland, I mean, they might sort of say like, okay, that's not, but certainly Kyiv, the mother of Russian cities, southeast Ukraine, central Ukraine, all of that. Belarus certainly belongs, potentially Transnistria, right, if you think of Novorossiya, but the Russian Mir is a very vague concept. And that's a thing sort of its appeal, like, is Bulgaria part of Ruski Mir? Why not, right? Like, it's because it's all about spiritual connection and all of these kinds of things. So in a way, it could have been benign if it was just, talk. I mean, maybe UK talks about, I don't know, what's the term for the former British Commonwealths, like Commonwealths, right? Like, but there is no sort of aggressive foreign policy agenda to try to undermine domestic governments there, to bring them into some form of political union, which is what Ruski Mir serves as an ideological justification for. So I think in that sense, it's much more dangerous concept. But as far as to whom it is aimed, it's like to whoever will listen. Because even if we look at, say, the definitions of the so-called compatriots, Russia has this law, the so-called соотечественники, compatriots. It is incredibly vague. It's people who feel themselves spiritually connected to Russia. Maybe half of this room is called in the соотечественники. So, like, be careful what you wish for. Right? So I think that's kind of this vagueness is actually serves a strategic interest. I think it's a tool because it could be very malleable. It could be kind of adjusted to different, in Abkhazia, right? They're not technically speaking, Russian speakers, but are they part of Ruski Mir? There is orthodoxy, right? There is some sort of spiritual connection. Sure, why not? So, yeah.
Okay, question from Connor Ford online.
Thank you very much. I'm here both as a senior at George Mason University and also as a chief petty officer stationed to the National Geospatial Agency. So we look at what's going on in the Ukrainian crisis every day. And my question is this, is that given that there's so much solidarity in the Ukrainians for their sovereignty, Putin still has full control of what's going on in Russia, as well with the conflict and having not moved in any dramatic fashion in almost the 3 years since it's been going. What would you say is the pivot point, or what would need to happen given where we are for all of this to end?
Well, I guess it depends how do you want it to end, right? Like Trump says, will he end the conflict in 24 hours or whatever it is that he says? So hypothetically, like if say tomorrow the West cut any kind of aid to Ukraine, right? Eventually Russia probably may be able to conquer certainly more territory and potentially, right, it's going to take years because Ukrainian army would fight, there would be insurgency, there would be, popular mobilization and all of these things. But ultimately, if Ukraine doesn't have the weapons to fight with, Russia would eventually prevail. So that's sort of one way to end the conflict. Then you can think of all the terrible geopolitical consequences, not just in Ukraine, but for European security more broadly, for US alliances, China, and like you can sort of, say, like, yes, it would end, but look at the cost of this, right? Another sort of way to end in Ukraine's favor, and I think the notion here, first of all, I wouldn't say that nothing happened, because if you actually look at what happened when, Russia invaded in February, and it was expectation that Ukraine would last, 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, something like this, not only it is still very much, sovereign state with functioning government and economy, they liberated like some 50% of the territory that Russia captured. They, creating all these problems for the Black Sea Fleet, they're striking within Russia. So I think a lot of things are happening. So I would sort of emphasize that I think this notion that sort of nothing is happening and that, Russia is firmly in control or on top of it, whatever you want to call it, I would, take it maybe with a more critical eye. And then I think what needs to happen for Ukraine to win, and actually I think just today, General Zaluzhny, who's commander of Ukrainian armed forces, had an article in CNN kind of laying out the needs. That's technological warfare, right? It's improvement in technology. It's, the weapons that Ukraine needs. It's this sort of degrading of Russian capabilities, and the eventual expectation, I think the hope is that not that Ukrainian army would march into Crimea in some, next counteroffensive or something like this, but there would be enough of a cost imposed on Russia, right? That then potentially we can get to the point of negotiations, but with Ukraine in a much stronger position. Because any kind of negotiation, when the threat is that Ukraine is forced to negotiate because it doesn't have anything to fight with, like why would Putin negotiate? He gave no indication that he narrowed down his maximalist goals of removing this, what you call the Nazi junta, right? Ukraine is not a real country. All the things they're doing on the occupied territory, anybody who speaks Ukrainian, who is perceived to be not in favor of occupation, it's torture chambers, all of this kind of stuff, right? So when you say how it ends, I think we have to sort of think like, what is the range of possible ends, and then which of these are more or less desirable. So I would say, that would be kind of the way I would rephrase that question.
I want to ask a question. Coming back to one of the arguments in the book that you talked about that I was intrigued by, just because I hadn't thought so much about it beforehand, but I saw one of the key themes of your talk as being that the divergence, there's a political divergence, right? And that Russia goes in the authoritarian direction, a retrenchment of authoritarianism, and Ukraine goes from this kind of stays in what Lucan would call this kind of like weak pluralism and, pluralism by weakness, but then continues to consolidate as a sort of more pluralistic democratic country. And I've thought a lot about, following Euromaidan, exactly, why what you talked about in your talk about the threat of Ukraine successfully democratizing, to what message does it send to the Russian population? What I wanted to push you on was, though, the counterfactuals here, right? So we have this, it's political science, right? Like this one rule, right? Like democracies don't fight each other. So if Russia was to democratize, and Ukraine had continued on this path, if you hadn't had this kind of Putin consolidation and you had this sort of weak pluralism in both countries, kind of 90s style Russia, 90s style Ukraine, that extends out, another 10, 15 years, what does that look like? But the other question being I thought it was sort of implicit in your talk that if Yanukovych had stayed, your counterfactual, if Yushchenko dies or if Yanukovych survives Euromaidan, you'd have these two more autocratic leaders, and that would immediately lead back to a kind of autocratic alliance with Yanukovych delivering Ukraine back to Putin. But is there a scenario under which we've seen lots of cases where autocracies are enemies of each other. Is there a situation where you have a more autocratic Ukraine that is still not delivered to Russia? And so I'd just be interested in hearing both of those. Or is the argument really dependent on the fact that one's a democracy, one's an autocracy, and that leads to this disentangling over time that gets harder and harder to come back from?
Right. No, all great questions. So for the democracy, yes, like we do say that's explicit in the book, that we don't think invasion and war would have happened had Russia retained the degree of political pluralism, even if it didn't simultaneously de-imperialize. If say the sort of notion that Ukraine is really somehow authentically part of Russia and this whole independence is ridiculous and all of these things, not everybody would have said, let's bring tanks across the border and do them in, right? There were all sorts of disagreements about how, and in the 90s, we see that. I mean, I've done separate research on that, all these narratives about what to do, with Ukraine, how to relate to them, anything from liberal empire, Chubai's idea, right? That sort of Russia becomes this reformed, attractive market economy, and then all of these former Soviet countries, because of cultural connection, family links, what have you, they sort of naturally gravitate, right? So Russia establishes itself as leader in the region, but through these more economic as opposed to coercive military means, right? Then, certainly there were, yes, so that's sort of the first thing. I think the two democracies not fighting each other probably would have had a confrontation, right? With authoritarianism, it's interesting, as I was saying, sort of given Yanukovych, his own authoritarian bent and the corruption, and given that sort of relying on the West, authoritarian Yanukovych would not have had the backing from the West because they really were recoiling from the fact he jailed Timoshenko, and IMF was saying that if you want the money, do the reforms, right? So then kind of Russia would have asked for something in return. And I think that's where sort of him delivering to Russia on this identity agenda would have become, even though maybe he himself could have potentially been agnostic about it. It's there were people in his camp that were very animated by it. He personally, I don't know if he ever read in history before, but he sort of felt very strongly about it. But that sort of becomes like a possibility. You know? But your third counterfactual, which we don't talk about in the book, because we thought about it, we couldn't really think of a scenario where Ukraine becomes authoritarian, but sort of more like West leaning, I guess, right? And kind of more nationalist. Is this what you're getting at?
It doesn't even have to be pro-West. It could be pro-West, but like if you think about like the Middle East, there are authoritarian. There's the Saudi
Right,
Arabia,
right.
Iran. Those
Yeah.
are two authoritarian regimes that are
Yeah.
loggerheads, right? Other places in Africa, like it's not a given.
Yeah.
So I just
think-
wonder about
yeah.
the automatic
I think
returning.
the only possibility, which again we did talk about it when we were writing these counterfactuals, and we decided that was just not possible. If in Ukraine, back either in the 1990s or in the early 2000s, there would have been very strong ethnic nationalist authoritarian agenda, which it never had. So this, far right notwithstanding, like it was always very small, very small. So the whole sort of nationalist camp originally was about 25% give or take. And within this quote unquote nationalist camp, most is sort of what we call national democratic. So yes, they want kind of cultural revival, protection of Ukrainian language, but they also want democracy, they want Western integration, they want market economy. It's not sort of the Orbans, it's more like you have us, right? Like, for example, Chernobyl, who ran against Kharchuk in the first election. It was actually interesting. Paul, I meant to do a Twitter strat on that. People were asked recently if they voted again in these first elections, who would they vote for? And now most say they would have voted for Chernobyl, even though at the time Kharchuk was the communist party leader, and Chernobyl was sort of the smaller pro-Western. So I think that the possibility for this would be like some sort of strong ethnic, non-democratic nationalism, which in Ukraine was just a tiny minority. So there were some groups like this, but they never had any chance to take part. So that I think would not be the possibility, because then it would be authoritarian and sort of kind of with identity agenda very different from Russia, and then the clash would still happen. Right? Yeah.
Do we have any more questions in the room? Anyone? I don't see any more hands online.
There's one question in the chat from Vlad Malinsky.
Okay, all right. So we'll go to there's one more question in the chat, which is great talk. Thank you. What is the perception now in Ukraine for about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact versus perceptions of the same in the Baltic states?
Right. Well, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? I mean, this is actually interesting because Putin has this narrative. I think he said it publicly. Kind of like tongue in cheek. He's like, well, Ukraine is doing all this decommunization, but it was the communist government, right? Stalin in particular, that through this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact kind of creates Ukraine and its contemporary borders, right? And gifts it, for lack of a better word, this Western territory, which was part of Poland, and which in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact goes to the Soviet state, right? And the same argument could be applied to the Baltics, that they, received whatever, that they, I mean, let me stick with Ukraine for a second, right? So in Ukraine, I think this narrative is rejected. So Putin is kind of like, like an interesting argument, what do you say to that? And what instead is emphasized more in Ukraine now, which has been emphasized in the Baltics for a long time, that in fact the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and this whole sort of Stalinization of these countries at the time destroyed previously existing independence, right? So in the Baltic countries, they were independent countries in the interwar period. So the idea that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact brought them anything good is sort of can be dismissed very easily, because to say, look, we were independent countries, then Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then Soviet Union annexes us, right? And so then we become again independent in 91, but you cannot possibly give any credit to the Soviet Union for this. In Ukraine, this argument was less apparent because the Ukrainian independence after the Bolshevik Revolution and collapse of the Tsarist Empire was much more short-lived. There was Ukrainian People's Republic that existed from 1917 to 1921. It is then crushed by the Bolsheviks, and actually West Ukrainian People's Republic, which is on the territories of Western Ukraine, which reunited with Ukrainian People's Republic into single state. And then that state very quickly was crushed by Poland from the one side and the Soviet forces from the other side, right? So this history was completely sort of like not on the radar of most of the population in the Soviet period at all. And this more recently, sort of there is this realization that we can't really say, like, do we really say Ukraine is a new state in 91? Well, it actually had statehood, right? And that statehood was crushed by Bolshevik Russia. So that makes this argument that Stalinism in particular, or Soviet rule in general, was something beneficial to Ukraine. Add to it the famine, add to it the deportations. We can say on balance, the cost, sort of the human cost, was really a lot of tragedy, so you can't really give Stalin any credit, right? Even though, yes, this territory then becomes part of Ukraine. So that's how it changed with the Baltics, because in the Baltics, that narrative was ejected right away.
Anyone else? All right, well then, everybody, please join me in thanking Oksana for just a really